Okay, so we will get started. Welcome to Desegregating Virginia's Libraries. I am Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. This program is being recorded and will be available on the Arlington County 55 Plus YouTube channel at a later time as time permits. Our speakers will be spotlighted so that only they appear in the recording. I am absolutely delighted to introduce Bridget Wisdom, Adult Services Librarian for Arlington Public Library at Central Library. This program is being brought to you jointly by Arlington Public Library and Arlington County's 55 Plus program. And it is always a pleasure to partner with Bridget, and I'm just delighted to have this opportunity. She's a wonderful partner. You're viewing this program through the Virtual Center for Active Adults, or VCAA, as it is affectionately known. VCAA is a partnership of Northern Virginia jurisdictions that provide free virtual programming for older adults and adults with disabilities in our area. Okay, with that taken care of, it is now my honor and pleasure to introduce Chris Barbuschak and Suzanne LaPierre, who are the authors of Desegregation in Northern Virginia Libraries. Chris Barbuschak, a Fairfax County native, is an archivist librarian at Fairfax County Public Library's Virginia Room. A graduate in history from Loyola University in Chicago, he received his master's in library science from Dominican University. Suzanne LaPierre is a Virginiana specialist librarian for Fairfax County Public Library and also works in the Virginia Room. Her writing has been published in national and international journals. In addition to her master's in library science from University of South Carolina, she holds an MA in Museum Studies from George Washington University and a BFA from Rhode Island School of Design. We ask that you please hold your questions until the end. We will have plenty of time for questions. You're more than welcome to enter your questions in the chat as we go along, but they will be addressed at the end. And now, without further ado, I am going to turn the program over to Chris Barbuschak and Suzanne LaPierre.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Suzanne and I are both really excited to be here to talk to you about desegregation in Northern Virginia libraries. Let's jump right in here. I've got a PowerPoint going. So how did we come to write this book? It began in April 2021. There was a new library board member that was appointed to the Fairfax County Library Board named Dr. Sujatha Hampton. That's her picture there in the top left. She is the third vice president of the NAACP Fairfax County chapter, and she's also the NAACP's education chair. And at a retreat for new board members, she posed the question, were Fairfax County public libraries ever segregated? And she also wanted to know if they weren't segregated, how is it possible that the school systems were segregated? Because that didn't make sense. So that question was directed to our library director, Jessica Hudson, who's pictured there on the left. And that question got directed to us, Suzanne and I, in the Virginia Room. So Jessica asked us, is it true? Were Fairfax County public libraries segregated, or were they not segregated? And she also asked us to look at what was going on in Northern Virginia as a whole, what was going on in Arlington Public Library or Prince William County Public Library. And she asked us to gather this research and come back to her and give a presentation before the board in September 2021. So this is how we did it. We have a lot of Fairfax County Public Libraries records in the Virginia Room, which is the local history and special collections branch of the Fairfax County Public Library System. So if you're into genealogy or local history, come visit us because we're the one-stop shop for Fairfax County history. So we have library board meeting minutes, which are pictured here that go all the way back to Fairfax County Public Library's founding in 1939. We have scrapbooks, we have correspondence, we have bookmobile records, all kinds of library records and memorabilia like that. So we mined those records to see what really was going on in Fairfax County. We also went to the Library of Virginia in Richmond, based down in Richmond, which has a lot of the records for all of the public libraries in the state. So we were also able to look at Arlington and Alexandria and Prince William and all that. And then we also made field trips. That's Suzanne down there in front of the Percival Library, which is the first public library in Prince William County, which was also segregated from the beginning. And then after about 5 or 6 months, we wrote a report. We actually had to force ourselves to stop because we kept finding more and more information. We reached out to community members, both white and black, and former library employees that were both black and white. And it just became such a labor of love that we kind of expanded beyond our paid hours of doing this and just did this all on our own time. So we wrote this report, we presented it before the board in September 2021. And upon completion, they said, you got to write a book. And so Suzanne and I did a little bit more deeper research, and we partnered with History Press and published this book in January 2023, earlier this year, because we wanted to make sure other people found out about these stories. So I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne now. We're going to talk a little bit about the different civil rights activists that made a difference and actually desegregated the public libraries in the surrounding Northern Virginia area.
Good morning, everyone. Every time Chris and I give this talk, we tweak it a little bit for the audience. So since we know a lot of you folks are in Arlington, we decided to start with Arlington today. In Arlington, before the Arlington Public Library existed as we know it today, there were lots of little independent libraries. Many of them were started by women's groups in the early 1900s or the early decades of the 1900s. And often they were operated out of church basements and so forth. However, most of these libraries were implicitly, if not explicitly, segregated for whites only. So in 1940, the Black residents of Arlington started the Henry Louis Holmes Public Library Association in order to provide library services for Black residents in Arlington. And this document that you see here is from the collection of Arlington's Center for Local History, is the Constitution of the the Henry Louis Holmes Library Association. And it reads, any individual who is interested in the library may become a member by making it known and participating in the work of the association. So this is something we saw a lot in our research throughout the region, is that the libraries established for Black residents didn't necessarily exclude white residents, but Black residents were unfortunately very often excluded from libraries that were whites only, which most libraries were at that time. So this association was started by a number of people, including the mother, Nora Drew, of Charles Drew, the pioneering Black surgeon who is known as the father of modern blood banking. And descendants of their family still live in Arlington today in the Penrose area. So if we could take a look at the next slide, I will show you who Henry Louis Holmes is. If you don't know why they named the library that, it was because Henry Louis Holmes was Arlington's Commissioner of Revenue in 1877 through 1904. He had been enslaved prior to the emancipation after the Civil War. And once he had his freedom, he moved to Arlington and the Freedmen's Village, and he was active in local politics, and he farmed and did a number of different kinds of work, and he amassed enough savings to purchase a large portion of land with his partner, William Butler, in 1879, and that later was subdivided and became known as the Butler Homes community and is now the Penrose neighborhood in Arlington. And many descendants of Henry Louis Holmes and the Butler family live still in that area. So he doesn't really have anything to do with libraries in particular, but he was a prominent Black citizen, so thus the library was named after him. So in 1944, the Arlington Public Library, which had formed as a government agency in 1937, absorbing some of the small independent libraries that had been started by women's groups that I mentioned earlier, partnered with the Holmes Library Association to create a branch for Black residents. And so in 1944, it was built. You see, they got a freestanding building there that you see. and it was located in the Carver Homes community that had been built for people who had been displaced during the construction of the Pentagon. So they had their, this enabled the Homes Library Association to become the Homes Library, and they had their own freestanding building instead of operating out of churches, and they had a collection. You can see the interior there is with the librarian and 2 children. However, the collection, as was often the case, or almost always the case with the libraries for Black residents, was separate but unequal, very tiny collection, less than half of the number of books that were in even the smallest library for white residents. Nevertheless, it was well utilized until, unfortunately, in 1949, the government decided to sell the land and the library had to be torn down. So by 1950, Arlington Public Library still had not found another place to launch the Homes Library, so they just quietly integrated all of the libraries in Arlington Public Library, probably because they knew that in 1946, the state of Virginia had a law that any library receiving state aid must be serving all residents. And so it's probably in alignment with that law that once this branch was closed, they realized that they needed to integrate all of the branches. However, we don't have any evidence that they made that known to the Black community, that they were now welcome to use any of the libraries in the county. Unfortunately, because everything was so segregated, the schools and the neighborhoods and the churches were still so segregated, many Black residents, or most Black residents, probably didn't know that they had access. In fact, we have oral history to suggest that they didn't know that they had access and or they didn't feel comfortable going into the formerly segregated libraries. So in the next slide, we see Mildred Johnson. She was the librarian at the Hoffman Boston High School in Arlington, which was the library for Black students in Arlington. And we're showing this slide because a lot of residents who didn't have access to public libraries would use the library at the Black high school. So there was a relationship between schools and libraries throughout our history, and often if residents didn't have access to a public library, they might be able to access a school library or vice versa. But much of Northern Virginia did not have a high school for Black students until, in Fairfax County, it wasn't until 1954 that there was a high school for Black students. So it was doubly cruel that Black residents could not use the public libraries when they also didn't have access to higher education for the most part. But Mildred Johnson was the librarian there until the school closed in 64, I believe, when integration became more fully embraced. And in the next slide, we're going to move on to the city of Alexandria, because this is where a very important case of library desegregation occurred. In 1939, this man who you see here is Samuel Tucker, and he was born and raised in Alexandria. He was a brilliant young man who attended Howard, and at the age of 20, he sat for the bar exam, having graduated already from Howard at that point. He started at age 16 at Howard, and he passed the bar exam at the age of 20 and had to wait until he was 21 to practice law, because that was the law. So very bright man. And while he was still in his 20s, you see him here probably, I'm guessing, in his 40s. But when he was still in his 20s, he was living and working and practicing law in Alexandria. And in 1937, the Alexandria Public Library opened just a couple of blocks from his home. So naturally, he would like to use that library instead of having to go downtown to Washington, D.C. to use a library. But he was denied access because the library was for white residents only. If you were white, but you didn't live in the city of Alexandria, you could pay a small fee to use the library. But if you were Black, you could not use the library, whether you were a lifelong resident of Alexandria, like Mr. Tucker, or not. So Mr. Tucker masterminded a plan to address this injustice. He had a lawsuit as well as a sit-down strike, which in 1939 was really unusual. Some people refer to it as America's first sit-down strike, although there is some evidence that there were some auto workers had some sit-down strikes prior to this, which Mr. Tucker might have learned about and modeled his efforts in part around or been inspired by. But so more about the lawsuit in the book, but for as far as the sitting goes, Mr. Tucker organized. Originally, there were 11 young men. 5 actually showed up that day because of their families concerned for their safety. One of them was Mr. Tucker's brother, Otto. And the plan was that they would each walk into the library, very polite and well-dressed, and ask to open a library account. And once they were denied and told that they were not eligible because of their race, they would proceed to take a book off the shelf and sit quietly at one of the tables in the library reading the book. So each of the 5 young men did this. Mr. Tucker himself did not participate because he wanted to be, as a lawyer, he wanted to be able to bail them out and defend them in court. But there was a young lookout who went to get Tucker and who kept Tucker informed of what was going on. And Mr. Tucker had arranged for the press to capture the photo that you see here on the right of the young protesters being arrested for sitting in the library. He was hoping that the publicity around the case, when some of these pictures appeared in the newspaper, would bring attention to the injustice of denying Black residents use of the library. But unfortunately, the efforts of Mr. Tucker did not result in the library desegregating. Instead, the city of Alexandria hastily built a separate library for Black residents, which was opened up less than a year later. And we have pictures in the next slide. So there on the right is the Robert Robinson Library, which was opened for the Black residents of Arlington less than a year after the strike in 1940. It opened. And as you can see in the middle there is a very crowded little library. It was very well utilized. There's a bunch of children at a story time, but it's very tiny. It's, again, an example of separate but unequal, nowhere near the facilities of the main library that was only for white residents. Old books that had been discarded from the main library or donated, and not nearly as many books, not nearly as much space. The librarian who was Black was paid half of the salary of the white librarian at the Alexandria Library, which still exists and is now known as the Barrett Branch. It's on Queen Street. And now there is a sign there that you can see on the left commemorating the sit-in. And so both libraries still exist. You can go to the Robinson Library. Also, it's now a Black History Museum. So a very early example of folks trying to obtain equal access to the library, and the solution that Mr. Tucker was very unhappy with, of having a separate but unequal library. So I just wanted to touch upon this difference between Arlington and Alexandria. So in Arlington, so both of these, as we know, are suburbs of Washington, D.C., bordering Washington, D.C. Why did the Arlington Library desegregate in 1950 and the Alexandria Library not fully desegregate until 1959 through 1962, even though Mr. Tucker had his strike in 1939 to bring attention to that? It wasn't until 1962 that Alexandria Library is fully integrated, including the children's services. So the main reason for this is that the presence of separate but unequal segregated libraries allowed the jurisdiction to claim to be in compliance with that Virginia law that I mentioned that said libraries receiving state aid must be serving all residents. They could, if they had a separate but unequal branch, say that they were serving all residents. However, as we saw with Arlington, we don't necessarily know that Black residents really knew that they had access to or felt welcome in those libraries. So another parallel that we found as we were going through our research, again, that the jurisdictions with segregated branches often desegregated later. And in the next slide, I think we are going back to Chris to hear what the history of basketball has to do with the history of library desegregation.
So there are 2 men who were responsible for desegregating Falls Church Public Library, one of whom was this man, Edwin B. Henderson. He spent a lifetime championing equal rights in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region. He wrote hundreds upon hundreds of op-eds pushing for civil rights in the Washington Post, among other newspapers. He was originally from Washington, D.C., born in April 1883, And in the fall of 1904, he became the first certified Black male instructor of physical education employed in the United States after accepting a job with DC Public Schools, and he went on to have a 50-year career there. Beginning in the summer of 1904, Henderson studied physical education at the Harvard University Summer School of Physical Training. It was there that he learned the new game of basketball from the guys that James Naismith, the founder of basketball, first taught in the 1890s. Henderson brought the game back to Washington, D.C. and introduced it to his students, and that's why he's known as the grandfather of Black basketball. After being refused admittance to a whites-only basketball game, he organized a league of his own and staged the first Black-only basketball game at True Reformers Hall on U Street, which actually still exists today. Henderson saw sports as a means of debunking the notion of racial inferiority and saw it as a way to open doors of opportunity. He subsequently organized the 12th Street YMCA basketball team and won the 1909-1910 Colored Basketball Championship. And that's Henderson there, pictured in the middle, holding the basketball. He played his last basketball game on Christmas Day 1910 because the previous day he got married and his wife asked him to stop playing basketball over concerns for his health. And the couple moved to Falls Church later that week, where his grandmother, who was formerly enslaved, had lived since emancipation. So a little bit of background about Falls Church, neighboring Arlington. Falls Church was an extremely segregated town. In 1890, the Falls Church Town Council had voted to retrocede 1/3 of the town's land, which is where most of the Black community lived, back to Fairfax County. The council's objective for doing this was to eliminate the Black vote, which had been influencing the local elections. So if you look at this map here, there's a yellow highlighted line there. Everything below that was where the Black community lived in Falls Church, and it was given back to Fairfax County. On the right there, that's a picture of young Henderson. 2 decades later, when Henderson's living in Falls Church, in December 1914, the council passed a segregation ordinance making it unlawful for Black residents to buy, sell, or even rent property in the town. Outraged, Henderson called together some of the town's leading Black citizens who formed the Colored Citizens Protective League, which is known as the CCPL, to protest this passage of the ordinance. The CCPL sued the city to prevent the enforcement of the ordinance and ultimately prevailed, and it eventually merged into the NAACP Falls Church chapter, becoming the first rural branch of the NAACP in this country in 1918, and Henderson was elected its secretary. The act, though, of desegregating Falls Church Public Library, which had been in existence since 1899, and it was segregated from the beginning, that would take a few more decades and involve one other guy in addition to Henderson. So below that map there is a church that says Colored Baptist Church. It's at the end of the street there. Today, that's Costner Avenue. And that's the Second Baptist Church. And the pastor of that church was this man, Reverend Wallace Costner. He was one of the most respected voices in Falls Church's Black community, and he would go out of his way to help anyone, whether he knew them or not. He also used the pulpit to fight for civil rights, particularly equality in public schools. Both Costner and Henderson played a vital role in desegregating Falls Church Public Library. In March 1950, the Falls Church Public Library held its first ever local authors night, in which they invited 22 local authors to speak, in the newspaper clipping of which you see there on the left. One of those invitees was Henderson, who had recently revised his book, The Negro in Sports, which you see there pictured on the right. And it was the first book ever written about the history of Black athletics in this country. 11 authors showed up to this event in Falls Church. It's not documented if Henderson was one of them. However, the book was featured in the library's display. The earliest mention we have that Falls Church Library was desegregated appeared in the library board minutes in 1953, in which they suggested they were operating on a non-segregated basis. But even at that point, and even if that was the case, Black citizens still weren't accessing the library. In November 1955, the library board directed the librarian, Mrs. Elizabeth Graham, to pursue the matter of library service to the city's Black residents by contacting Reverend Costner and E.B. Henderson. The issue of library access seems to have arisen in response to an earlier inquiry from both Reverend Costner and Henderson. At the meeting, the three discussed the best ways to serve the Black community, both children and adults, and they asked the principals of the local segregated schools be contacted to notify that those children could indeed access the library. But despite these efforts, local Black educators still faced obstacles when obtaining access to this library a year later. Costner again reached out to the library board in 1956 and wrote a letter inquiring about borrowing privileges for teachers at the James Lee School, which was the segregated Falls Church School at the time there, and they just were not able to check out books. The librarian, Elizabeth Shaw, wrote this letter back to him, saying that the board passed a resolution that any teacher in the Fairfax County public school system teaching children who resided in the city of Falls Church were now entitled to a free library card, and the librarian asked Costner to personally convey this information to both the segregated schools, which was James Lee and Luther Jackson High School. In 1958, construction was completed on the permanent Falls Church Public Library, which still exists today. It's known as the Mary Raleigh Stiles Library. And Henderson was involved with both the planning and dedication of that building. He and his wife attended the dedication ceremony and signed the library's guest book on opening day. That's it in the background there, and on the right is both of their signatures. And a few years later, Henderson was invited to the library's first oral history panel session to celebrate National Library Week in 1965. And that's him pictured there smoking a pipe at this oral history recording session. And his recollections about life in Falls Church during the 1890s were heard by 80 citizens and recorded for posterity. So in recent years, Henderson has received a lot of accolades and spotlights. Just this year in June, the University of District Columbia dedicated a statue in his honor. And 2 years ago, they renamed their athletic facility the Dr. Edwin Bancroft Henderson Sports Complex. The Washington Wizards also last year named its Philanthropic Team Player Award after him. And there's a couple memorials in the city of Falls Church, including a plaque that was erected in front of his house also just 2 years ago in 2021. Costner, on the other hand, who's pictured there on the left there with Henderson's mother, has he did so much for civil rights activism in Falls Church and in Northern Virginia. He's kind of fallen away from the spotlight. So we're hoping this book kind of puts him back out there and recognizes all of the efforts that he did, both in the schools and with the library. So on to Fairfax County. Let's talk a little bit about what was going on in Fairfax County. The guy who desegregated Vienna Public Library was this man, William McKinley Carter. He was a prominent lifelong resident of Vienna and a descendant of the Carter family, which had been living in the Vienna area since 1842. He was president of the Citizens Progressive Association of Vienna and a charter member of the Fairfax County NAACP chapter. When Carter was living in Vienna, the only library in the area at the time was this one, the Vienna Town Library, which had been built in 1897. It actually still exists today. It's been moved a couple times, but now it's a little library museum. The library's 1912 charter recorded that its use was restricted to only the town's white inhabitants. In 1957, Carter retired from a 37-year career with the IRS, and it was around this time that a shocking incident occurred between the Vienna Town Library and his children. A white woman, unaware of the library's segregated rules, checked out books to Carter's children who were able to bring them home with them. Wendell Carter, one of those children, later recalled, quote, "Once the board of trustees found out we had the books, they came and took them back. That kind of perturbed my dad and some friends," end quote. In 1958, disgruntled citizens met in William Carter's living room and informally established the Friends of the Library, Vienna, Virginia, which is a biracial organization, and Carter was elected as the Friends treasurer. The Friends attempted to work with the existing Vienna Town Library, but when it became quickly apparent they weren't going to change their ways, they contacted Fairfax County Public Library, and arrangements were made to establish a branch in Vienna, as by then, FCPL was already desegregated and serving everybody. A little bit of background about FCPL, they were established in 1939, and they also were segregated from the beginning. It originally only provided bookmobile service to the county's residents, but it maintained a segregated book collection for both whites and blacks. So if you were white, you couldn't use the black collection. If you were black, you couldn't use the black collection of books. Whites could get library books from multiple bookmobile stops that were also at the schools, also at existing community libraries that had already predated FCPL. But if you were black, and using the FCPL system, the bookmobile system, you could only get books at 2 deposit stations in the 1940s. In 1954, the system had quietly desegregated. So by the time Vienna came on the scene trying to court FCPL for a branch, they were desegregated. So after tremendous enthusiastic support and fundraising from the Vienna community, the Patrick Henry Library branch, which still exists today, opened up in a shopping center storefront in April 1962. And this is the lease signing ceremony for that library branch, and that's William Carter there in the background there. Subsequently, Carter became the Vienna Citizen of the Year. He was awarded such an award in 1969. And in 1968, the Friends dedicated a special bookshelf in his honor and also his wife Lillian's honor. And this is a picture from that ceremony there. That's William Carter there in the middle there. We have, that shelf was a section for where gift books were supposed to be placed on the library. The shelf no longer exists, but many of those books got transferred to the library here in the Virginia room. And this is actually a nameplate from one of those books that was gifted in honor of Mr. and Mrs. William McKinley Carter. Eventually, the Patrick Henry Library moved out of the storefront into a permanent branch in 1971, which still exists. And that's Carter there, pictured there in the middle. He died in 1977 at age 81, but a portrait of both him and his wife hang in the Patrick Henry Library's meeting room to this day. One quick note about Prince William Public Library. Prince William Public Library was the only library system that was established and desegregated from the moment of its establishment in 1952. The bookmobile did visit the desegregated schools. That's a picture on the right there of them visiting, I believe is the Antioch School in the Manassas area, but that's one of the rarer library systems that actually was desegregated from the beginning. Back to Suzanne to talk about Loudoun County and wrapping it up with the Murrays.
This beautiful family portrait that you see here is Samuel Cardoza Murray on the right, Josie Cook Murray on the left, and their little son Samuel Keith Murray, taken in 1950. This photo is very near and dear to our hearts because we had a little bit of trouble finding a photo of the Murrays and being sure that it really was them for the book. So we're glad to have this photo of the family. So the Murrays were decorators. They owned an upholstery shop in Purcellville, which is part of Loudoun County. And they made draperies and they reupholstered furniture and they made various decor for people's homes. And they were very well thought of and received commissions from some prominent local citizens. So one day in 1956, they received a commission from none other than President Eisenhower's sister-in-law, who lived nearby in Hillsborough, Mrs. Moore. And she asked them to make a certain style of Austrian draperies for her home. Well, they weren't exactly sure how to make that particular type of drapery, so they went to the Purcellville Public Library, which was the only public library in Loudoun County at that time, to check out a book about this type of drapery. Well, they were not permitted to check out a book because of their race. And Mr. Murray decided to take legal action. Interestingly enough, even though, as I told you, the 1946 law stated that the libraries receiving state aid must be serving all residents, and the Purcellville Library was not, they still had trouble finding legal representation. A lot of lawyers didn't want to take on a civil rights case, but eventually they did receive representation and approached the library board with the fact that they were not serving people of color in the county. And the library board had to, face the reality of that, and they did agree to desegregate in 1950, early 1957. But the segregationists in the area would not accept that. They called themselves defenders of state sovereignty and individual liberty, and they vowed to close the library or move it to private funding to avoid integration. So they tried to prevent the county board of supervisors from funding the library, because if it received the state funding, then they would be required to integrate. So after much drama, the county board of supervisors did narrowly vote to approve the funding, which would entail integration in 1957, and the library was officially integrated, and that was the first victory of the civil rights movement in Loudoun County, thanks to this mild-mannered family here. And in the next slide, you'll see that after the library became integrated, the Murrays finished up their decorating job for Mrs. Moore, and President and Mrs. Eisenhower went to visit the Moores' home and saw these draperies that were very stylish at the time, and asked the Murrays to do similar draperies and other furnishings for their home near Gettysburg. So if you go to the Eisenhower National Historic Site near Gettysburg, you'll see these Austrian-style draperies in nearly every room of the home. And the Percival Public Library still exists. It's part of the Loudoun County Public Library System. So in conclusion, we encourage you to read the book to learn much more about these cases in Northern Virginia, but also we have examples of cases elsewhere in Virginia for more context. And we also talk about the situation in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. was an important resource for Black scholars in Northern Virginia who were able to go into D.C. and use the Library of Congress or D.C. Public Library. We go into more about the issues of implicit versus explicit segregation. There's over 100 photos in the book that many of which have never been published before. And much of the research in the book is derived from local archives and has never been published before. We also show you local sites that you can go visit today if you want to experience some of this history firsthand. And the photo that you see here is actually in Petersburg. Some library protesters are being held overnight in jail in Petersburg. And one of those protesters was Wyatt T. Walker, who later became the chief of staff of Dr. Martin Luther King. So there's a link between library civil rights activism and the greater civil rights movement of the 60s. In addition, many libraries, because of that 1946 law, stating that they must serve all residents if they're receiving funding, libraries were often the first public institution to be desegregated and had a domino effect on other public facilities being desegregated. So it's an important part of the overall civil rights movement, and we hope you'll check out the book for more information. Also, Arlington Public Library's Local History Center has put together in addition to their website about the Holmes Library. So if you want to learn more about the situation in Arlington, you can check that out. And they have lots of primary source documents that you can look at and links to people and places that had to do with the Holmes Library and the desegregation in Arlington. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. And I hope we can maybe answer some questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Chris and Suzanne. This was absolutely fabulous, fascinating. I really appreciate it. Thank you for the focus on Arlington in the beginning. We appreciate it. We love our local history. I am struck by how when I was growing up, these things were happening in Virginia, and I never would have known. And I think this was very eye-opening. I'm really grateful to have learned this. We do have a raised hand. Ingrid, would you like to lead us off with questions?
Thank you. First of all, I'm so grateful for your book. I live in Arlington. Our kids attended Green Hedges School. Kenton Kilmer was co-founder of that school and was involved with this desegregation in Vienna. And I had the privilege of interviewing Wendell Carter in the year before he died, so 2011. And I was amazed at how there wasn't anything about this that I could read. So I was digging through some of the library resources for our own newsletter. And I've carried this story with me. So it's so wonderful to have it sort of out and to have a context now also for it in the larger Northern Virginia community. So here's my question. So congratulations on your book, which I'm reading. I wonder what you would say, if anything, about in the way you described, you compared Arlington and Alexandria. How did Vienna fit in that sort of, look at the microclimate of segregation in the town, if there's anything we can say about that? And what I'm thinking about is, in some ways, it seems like there was a lot of collaboration between white people and Black people, African American people. And I'm aware of this Malcolm Window for Citizens Association, which comprised of people from white and Black neighborhoods. I'm just wondering how all that, if you have any thoughts on how that showed up in the process.
Well, first of all, wow, if you still have like the article or interview with Wendell Carter, I'd love to see it if you still have it, and love to know what he talked about. Yeah, he unfortunately had already passed before we came across this, and I had never heard that story before until I talked to a former librarian from the Patrick Henry Library in Vienna that worked there in like 68 or thereabouts, and she had been told this story. And a couple other librarians have been told the story as well. And we found an article from the 70s that had also documented the story about the library board going to Carter's house and demanding the books back. So I'd also been told by that same librarian that the Fairfax County Public Library in 1989, it was like I think the 25th anniversary of the library. And so they wrote a whole history of the library system, but didn't even focus on anything about its segregationist past, and was told like, oh, we can't include that story about the Carters because it's not appropriate or something to that effect. So yeah, amazing, like such a story that nobody had really ever heard about before, that just was responsible for why Vienna has a Patrick Henry Library. And that's why this book kind of became a labor of love for both Suzanne and I, and such a passion project, because this history had never really been looked at before. Like, everybody has done a lot of research about like the schools in Arlington or Fairfax County, why they were the desegregation process and the environment that it was when it was segregated. But nobody had ever asked the question like libraries. Like, you don't really think like libraries, like not everybody could go into a library. So it quickly became apparent that nobody had ever researched that before, and that's why we just kind of like engulfed ourselves into researching this. In terms of Vienna, compared to like Alexandria and Arlington, I think this movement of with the Vienna Friends Library was really unique, where everyone did come together, and this is before the schools were desegregated in Fairfax County. That wasn't until fully desegregated until 1965, and it's about 58, 59, and 60 that Vienna, the whole community is coming together to fight for a library for everyone. So that was really unique in that part. And it all started in William Carter's living room. Everyone came together in William Carter's room, and Kenton Kilmore was the president of the Vienna Friends, and they got support from the Vienna Town Council, which was the council that had been providing monetary support for this segregated Vienna Town Library for like 50 years. So it was a unique situation, I think, between definitely Alexandria, but Arlington quietly was like, let's desegregate. But yeah, this didn't show up anywhere else, I don't think.
Thank you so much. I got goosebumps, so thanks very much. I'll look for that article.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah.
We have another question in the chat. Well, first thanking you for the presentation and then referring to an exhibit in Arlington County and asking whether it's at Central Library. And I'm not sure I understand about
It's online. It's a digital exhibit. It's a website that they created, and it has all of the like scanned library board minutes or correspondence and photographs. I think if you just Google search like Arlington Public Library Holmes branch or desegregation, it should be like the first or second hit up there. But they were doing the research about the same time that we started ours. And they did an amazing job mining the records that they had there. Center for Local History, if you haven't been in Arlington, it's an amazing repository there. If you're interested in Arlington history, they've got some cool stuff.
We have another comment in the chat. Excellent and informative yet sobering presentation. Thank you so much. And I never knew about the origin of the Penrose name. I'm from New York City, and when we traveled here in the 1950s, we were appalled at the segregation and the way some of our fellow citizens were treated here in Arlington. It is, I mean, I'm also from New York, and my reaction is the same. I would never have known these things were happening in Virginia, which I think is so cosmopolitan and up to the minute. But to hear that the Fairfax County Public Schools weren't fully desegregated until 1965, I mean, that's kind of shocking. Bridget has put a link in the chat, and you want to comment on that, Bridget? You're on mute.
I am, thank you. No, I was just dropping a link to the exhibit that Chris had mentioned for the Henry Holmes Library exhibit that the Center for Local History has done here at Central and Arlington Public Library. That's all I dropped. Thank you for such a great presentation, Chris and Suzanne. Do you have more questions, Sheila?
I don't have any more in the chat. Just want to give people one more chance if they would like to just raise their hand or just unmute themselves and ask their question. Please feel free to do that.
There is a framed portrait of Henry Louis Holmes that was it's in the Arlington Courthouse, but I think that section has been renovated in the last year or so, so I'm not sure if it's still hanging up there. I was on the second floor. I'm not sure if they've moved it or put it somewhere else. It was an original portrait of him.
I just want to ask Chris and Suzanne, you were talking as you were listening, and I was reminded of a book that we have here in our news section. It's called Public in Name Only. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yes. I have it. In fact, I can read you a quote from it if you'd like.
I would love to. I've got it on my on my to be read list, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
It came out about the same time as ours, and I just finished it. I had started it a while ago, but I just finished it the other day, and I was struck by a quote from Buddy Evans, who was one of the 5 young men who was in the Alexandria sit-in. He was later interviewed, and he said he was asked if he was afraid, and he said, well, yes, he was, but he said it was something that had to be done, and someone had to do it, and if everybody said no, it would never have gotten done. So just a simple quote, but so indicative of the contributions of these citizens turned civil rights activists who helped open up the libraries for everyone.
And you're continuing the work with your book, and so we appreciate that. It's just amazing to me. As I was reading your book, I was just, as I mentioned earlier, there's sometimes I was just cringing. There's so many untold stories. So the importance of your work, thank you for it. I would like to drop one more thing in the chat. I know I'm creating a link farm here, but I have a short reading list, which includes your book and some similar titles that people may be interested in as well. But thank you for answering my question on the other book. And thank you again, Sheila, for partnering, and Chris and Suzanne for being here today.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and thank you, Chris and Suzanne. This was fascinating, really fabulous program. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your being with us and look forward to seeing you next time on Zoom.
Thank you.
Thank you.